Daniel Cole knelt on the plywood subfloor of the 14th floor, a carpenter's pencil behind his ear, writing measurements along a stud in neat, slanted block letters. Behind him, heels clicked to a stop. "You write like a draftsman," a woman's voice said, half amused, half mocking. "Did they not teach cursive at whatever trade school you went to?" Daniel didn't look up, didn't go to one. She laughed short, dismissive, and walked off toward the site trailer. 6 days later, that same woman would be standing in her late husband's study at midnight, holding a blueprint against Daniel's handwriting under a desk lamp, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the page steady. Keep that image in mind. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why. 6 weeks earlier, Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Daniel Cole had been framing floors for Kessler Development for the better part of 2 years. Ever since he and his daughter Ruby had moved back to the town he grew up in. He was good at his job, quiet, exact, the kind of tradesman other guys on the crew asked to double-check their layouts before the inspector came through. Nobody at Kessler knew much more about him than that. He showed up at 6 a.m., left sharp at 4 to make it to Ruby's school pickup, and never once complained about a double shift he couldn't take. Ruby was 7, missing her front teeth, and convinced her father's job was the most interesting 1 inches the world, mostly because he sometimes brought home leftover pencils, shaped like tiny yellow houses. Every evening she'd meet him at the site gate with a granola bar and a full report of her day, delivered at the volume only a 7-year-old could manage. The Fairhaven Commons project, 20 stories of luxury residential, going up 3 blocks from the harbor, was the biggest job Kessler had ever landed, and it belonged on paper and in practice to Whitfield Holdings, which meant it belonged to Vivian Whitfield. Vivian had taken over Whitfield Holdings 18 months earlier, after her husband Marcus died in a car accident on the Merritt Parkway on his way back from a site visit no one else could remember scheduling. She'd inherited a company, a board that didn't fully trust a widow to run it, and a grief she hadn't found time to feel yet because there was always another decision that couldn't wait. She visited job sites the way her husband had unannounced, hard hat slightly crooked, asking questions contractors weren't used to a client asking. That morning, walking the framing crew's floor with her project manager trailing 2 steps behind, she'd stopped at Daniel's stud wall, glanced at the measurements written along the lumber, and made the comment about cursive without thinking twice about it. Daniel hadn't taken it personally. People said worse. He went back to his tape measure and didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when Vivian's project manager, Alan Reyes, pulled him aside near the hoist. "Miss Whitfield wants the load calculations redone on the east wing cantilever," Alan said. "Engineer's out sick. You know enough about structural to sanity. Check it before she signs off." Daniel hesitated. It wasn't his job. It also wasn't the first time in his life someone had asked him a structural question, and assumed the answer would take him an hour to work out. It took him 20 minutes. Vivian reviewed the numbers that evening without knowing who'd written them, only that they were correct, cleaner than the original engineer's draft, and annotated in the margins with 2 small corrections. Nobody had asked for, but that fixed a tolerance issue buried 3 pages deep. "Who did this?" she asked Alan the next morning. "Framing crew, guy named Daniel Cole." She didn't say anything else about it, but she found herself watching the framing crew a little longer than she needed to for the rest of that site walk. The way you watch something that doesn't quite match the story you'd already decided about it. That evening, alone in what had been Marcus's study, a room she still hadn't fully moved into, still smelling faintly of the cedar he used to keep in the desk drawer, Vivian pulled out the box of old Whitfield project files she'd been meaning to sort through for a year. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She told herself that, at least, she found the annotation on a blueprint from a project Marcus had run 8 years earlier, before Whitfield Holdings had gotten big enough to hire out every structural review. A small correction in the margin, in the same slanted block print she'd seen that afternoon. She told herself it was a coincidence. Plenty of tradesmen wrote that way. She didn't sleep well that night, and she couldn't have said exactly why. Over the next 2 weeks, Vivian found reasons to be at the Commons site more often than a CEO strictly needed to be. She told her board it was oversight on the company's flagship project. She told herself the same thing most days. She noticed things about Daniel, the way you notice things about someone you've decided not to ask directly about. He never let the younger guys on the crew carry more than they should. He caught a lumber count error that would have cost the project 2 weeks and never made it about being right, just quietly flagged it to the foreman and moved on. When Ruby showed up at the gate one afternoon while Vivian was walking the site, Daniel crouched to her exact eye level to hear about her day. The same unhurried attention he gave a beam that didn't sit square. "Is that your daughter?" Vivian asked. The first personal question she'd asked him. "Ruby," Daniel said. "She thinks I build houses for a living. Easier than the alternative explanation." "What's the alternative explanation?" Daniel considered the question the way he considered a load calculation carefully, and longer than most people would. "That's a longer conversation than I've got time for on a Tuesday." Vivian didn't push. She'd learned, over 18 months of running a company she never asked to inherit, that people told you what they were ready to tell you, and rushing them only closed the door faster. But the blueprint sat folded in her bag for 2 weeks, and she kept meaning to ask him to look at it properly, and kept finding reasons not to. The reveal came the way these things always do, sideways, from someone who wasn't trying to cause one. Whitfield's retired structural consultant, Harold Voss, stopped by the site to review the cantilever fix Daniel had sketched out weeks earlier. Harold had worked with Marcus for 15 years before retiring, and he studied the annotation on the plans for a long moment before looking up. "Who wrote this?" "Framing crew guy," Alan said. "Cole." Harold's expression shifted. "Daniel Cole? Structural Daniel Cole?" Vivian, a few feet away reviewing a punch list, looked up slowly. "He worked under me for 6 years at Ashgrove Structural," Harold said. "Best safety engineer I ever trained. Caught a shear wall miscalculation on the Ashgrove Tower that would have been a headline if it shipped. Then he just disappeared. Word was he walked off the whole industry after his wife passed. Nobody could get him to answer an email." Vivian didn't move for a long moment. She was doing the math in her head, the way she'd been doing it without letting herself finish the equation for 2 weeks. She found Daniel at the end of his shift, coiling extension cords by the gate. "You could have said something," she said. Daniel didn't look up right away. "Wasn't relevant to framing a stud wall. That's not why you didn't say it." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, without looking at her, "I left structural 6 years ago. Same month my wife died. I was good at catching the mistake that gets somebody killed. I wasn't good at being the reason my daughter grew up with a father who was never home to catch anything of hers." He set the extension cord down. "I'm not hiding a career, Vivian. I just didn't see the point in bringing up a version of my life that isn't mine anymore." Vivian looked at him, really looked, in a way she hadn't quite let herself before, and something in her chest recognized something in his. The specific exhaustion of building a smaller life out of the wreckage of a bigger one, and calling it enough because it had to be. She didn't say any of that out loud. She only nodded once and let the moment pass. That night, she finally unfolded the blueprint from her bag under the desk lamp in Marcus's study, and held it next to a side note Daniel had written that afternoon. The handwriting matched. Not similar, identical. The same slanted block print. The same particular way he crossed his sevens. She sat very still for a long time before she understood what she was actually looking at. Not a coincidence, but a signature. Daniel Cole had reviewed the original structural plans for the very first Whitfield property Marcus had ever built 11 years ago. Back when Whitfield Holdings was 3 employees and a single row house renovation, back before anyone in the family had money enough to be careless with it. Marcus had never mentioned the name, but he'd kept the blueprint for 11 years, tucked in a drawer he never cleared out, which meant it had mattered to him, which meant, somehow, Daniel Cole had already been quietly holding up the foundation of Vivian's entire life before she'd ever met him. While Vivian was piecing together a decade-old blueprint, her company's CFO, Preston Marsh, was piecing together something else entirely. A way to force the board's hand before Vivian's 2-year probationary control of Whitfield Holdings expired. Preston had been close to Marcus, closer than Vivian had ever fully trusted. though she'd never had proof of anything, only the low hum of instinct that told her not to leave him alone in a room with the financials for too long. He'd spent the last year quietly steering the Commons project's budget through a shell vendor, padding change order invoices by amounts small enough not to trigger an audit, large enough to matter over 18 months. Vivian's assistant, Renata Cruz, had noticed the pattern first, a maintenance and materials line item that never quite matched the actual delivery logs from the site. She'd flagged it once quietly and been told by Preston it was a rounding issue with the new accounting software. She hadn't fully believed him. She also hadn't yet found the nerve to push harder against a man 20 years her senior, who'd been at the company since before she was hired. It was Daniel, of all people, who noticed the discrepancy first from the ground, a materials delivery that showed up on the invoice as triple the lumber actually unloaded at the site. He mentioned it to the foreman as a courtesy, the same way he'd mention a stud that didn't sit square. The foreman mentioned it to Alan. Alan, uneasy, finally mentioned it to Renata. Renata spent a weekend cross, referencing 18 months of shell vendor invoices against actual delivery logs, and found what she'd been afraid she'd find, a pattern that traced back to a company registered to a PO box. With Preston Marsh listed as the agent on file, she brought it to Vivian on a Monday morning, hands not quite steady around the folder. "I should have said something sooner," Renata admitted. "I didn't want to believe what it meant." The board convened on a Thursday, 3 weeks before Vivian's probationary control was set to expire, and full oversight would revert to a 7-person committee that included Preston. Preston opened with the argument he'd clearly rehearsed: the Commons project was over budget. Sentiment was clouding sound financial judgment, and perhaps it was time the board considered additional financial oversight going forward. He didn't say Vivian's name. He didn't need to. Vivian let him finish. Then she laid out the delivery logs beside the shell vendor invoices, month by month, in a stack that made the pattern impossible to misread. 18 months of padded invoices, she said, routed through a vendor registered to Preston Marsh, starting 4 months before my husband died and continuing every month since. The room went very still. Preston tried to turn it. "This is exactly the kind of erratic judgment I've been raising concerns about. Ask yourselves whose objectivity is actually compromised in this room." "Ask yourselves," Vivian said, calm and level, "why a shell vendor tied to our CFO started billing this company 4 months before my husband's fatal accident, on a stretch of road he wasn't scheduled to be driving that week." She hadn't meant to say that last part out loud. She watched it land anyway. The board member, who'd worked alongside Marcus for 20 years, turned to Preston fully for the first time. "You built half your career sitting next to that man. I'd like to know how you sat across from his widow for 18 months and let this run the whole time." Preston didn't have an answer that survived the silence that followed. The vote came 7-1. Preston was suspended, pending a full financial and legal review, escorted out by the same board member who'd questioned Vivian's judgment only weeks before. Vivian found Daniel at the site that evening, coiling the same extension cords he'd been coiling the day she first noticed him. "It's done," she said. "Preston's gone." Daniel nodded once, the way he did when a joint finally sat square after 3 tries. "You didn't need me for that part." "No," she said, "but I needed the delivery numbers you noticed, and I needed to stop being too afraid to look at what was sitting in front of me the whole time. You're better at both of those than you let on." He didn't answer that directly. Something in his face eased instead. She held out the blueprint, the one from Marcus's drawer, 11 years old, his handwriting matching the annotation in the corner. "My husband kept this for 11 years, she said. "I think he knew exactly who you were before either of us did." Daniel looked at the page a long time. "I didn't remember the project. There were a lot of row houses that year." He traced the margin note with one finger. "But I remember the feeling of getting something right when nobody was watching. I stopped getting to feel that for a long time." "You could feel it again," Vivian said, "if you wanted to." 3 weeks later, Vivian created a position that hadn't existed at Whitfield Holdings before: Director of Structural Integrity, reporting directly to her, with one condition: Daniel negotiated himself every safety flag from any tradesman on any site would go through an independent review before it was ever dismissed or buried. He didn't take it right away. He carried the offer home and set it on the kitchen table for a week, the way he'd once turn over a piece of lumber before deciding what to build from it. It was Ruby who settled it, without meaning to, the way children do. "Are you going to keep building houses forever?" she asked over dinner, not looking up from her plate. Daniel thought about the years of double shifts, and the years before that, and the 6 years he'd spent building a smaller, steadier life instead of a bigger, riskier one. He thought about the framing crew who'd trusted his eye without knowing why they should. He thought about a woman standing in her late husband's study at midnight, matching his handwriting against a decade-old blueprint because some part of her had recognized something true before she had words for it. He called Vivian 2 days later and said yes on the condition he kept his 4 p.m. pickups. No exceptions. She agreed before he'd finished the sentence. 6 months later, on the top floor of the finished Fairhaven Commons, Daniel knelt on the polished subfloor of the model unit, writing a final punch list note in the same slanted block letters he'd always used. Vivian stopped beside him, arms crossed, the ghost of a smile on her face. "You still write like a draftsman." Daniel looked up. "Somebody once told me that like it was an insult." "I was wrong," Vivian said. "It's the only handwriting in this whole company I've ever trusted without checking twice." Ruby's voice carried up the stairwell, already narrating some elaborate story to Renata about the view from the roof. Outside the window, the harbor caught the late afternoon light the way it had for 100 years before this building existed, patient and indifferent to boardrooms and blueprints. And everything 2 people had almost missed seeing in each other. Daniel set down his pencil and stood. "Ready?" Vivian asked. "Yeah," he said. "I think I finally am."